Hello and welcome to the Biological Anthropology lecture series. I'm Dr. Richard Jonathan O. Tadurin. Here we explore what it means to be human, biologically, evolutionarily, and behaviorally. Let's begin our journey into the science of humanity. Welcome to Module 11, the Agricultural Revolution. Here we explore how the agricultural revolution reshaped human biology, health, and our evolutionary trajectory. Let's revisit where we've been. For most of our evolutionary history, humans lived as foragers, highly mobile, flexible, and deeply attuned to seasonal environments. Then, relatively suddenly in evolutionary terms, something changed. Around 10,000 years ago, some human populations began to farm. Think about this for a moment. In a species that evolved to move, we chose to stay. In bodies shaped by dietary diversity, we narrowed what we ate. That decision would quietly transform our biology. Agriculture was not just a new way to get food. It reorganized daily life, altered patterns of growth and disease, and changed how bodies developed over generations. Teeth, jaws, skeletons, immune systems, these all began to reflect a new relationship between humans, food, and environment. You might wonder why this matters today. The answer is simple. Many modern health issues make much more sense when viewed through this evolutionary lens. Let's look at agriculture not as a clear advance, but as a trade-off. Farming allowed populations to grow and societies to become more complex, but it also introduced new stresses, nutritional limitations, infectious disease, and physical strain. These were not failures of evolution, but consequences of rapid cultural change. As we move through this module, keep one idea in mind. Agriculture was the first major moment when human culture began reshaping human biology at scale. Understanding that moment helps us make sense of the evolutionary present and prepares us to ask what comes next. In this section, we trace the transition from foraging to farming and how domestication transformed human societies. Let's revisit how humans lived for most of their evolutionary history. For tens of thousands of years, our species survived as foragers, relying on hunting, fishing, and gathering a wide variety of wild foods. This lifestyle required mobility, detailed environmental knowledge, and flexibility. People moved with the seasons, followed animal migrations, and adjusted their diets as landscapes changed. Think about this for a moment. The human body you have today is largely shaped by this long foraging past. Now let's look at what began to change near the end of the last ice age. As global climates became warmer and more stable, some human groups started spending longer periods in the same places. Wild grains, root crops, and animals that were once simply collected or hunted began to be managed more intentionally. This did not happen overnight. Farming was not a sudden invention, but a gradual shift in how humans interacted with their environment. Early agriculture often grew out of what we call broad-spectrum foraging, where people relied on many food sources rather than a single staple. Over time, certain plants were favored because they were easier to harvest, store, or replant. Humans unknowingly selected for traits like larger seeds or non-shattering stalks. In doing so, they began to change the biology of plants, even as those plants started to change human routines and settlement patterns. You might wonder why people adopted farming if foraging worked so well. The answer is complex. Farming could support more people in a smaller area, especially as populations grew. It also provided a more predictable food supply, at least in theory. But predictability came at a cost. Diets often became narrower, workloads increased, and dependence on crops made communities vulnerable to drought and failure. Think about the shift this way. Foraging was like having a diversified portfolio spread across many food sources. Farming was more like putting your resources into a smaller number of high-yield investments. The returns could be great, but the risks were higher. By choosing to farm, humans began to reshape landscapes, ecosystems, and daily life. This transition from foraging to farming marks one of the most profound turning points in human evolution, setting the stage for everything that followed. From villages and cities to new biological challenges, we are still dealing with today. Let's revisit a question that often comes up at this point. Why did agriculture emerge at all, and why did it appear in different parts of the world without contact between them? For a long time, people assumed farming was an obvious improvement. But when you look closely, foraging was actually very effective, so agriculture needs an explanation, not an assumption. Let's look first at the broader environmental context. Toward the end of the last ice age, global climates became warmer and more stable. Seasons were more predictable, and in many regions, plant and animal communities expanded. This stability mattered. When environments stop fluctuating wildly, investing time and labor in particular places starts to make sense. Think about it this way. You're more likely to plant seeds if you're confident the ground will still be there next year. Climate alone does not explain agriculture. Humans had lived through earlier warm periods without domesticating plants or animals. What changed was the interaction between environment, population, and culture. As some foraging populations grew, competition for resources increased. In these contexts, intensifying food production by tending plants or managing animals became one way to support more people in the same area. You might wonder why this matters. It tells us agriculture was often a response to pressure, not a sudden leap forward. Let's also think about human behavior. Foragers were already deeply knowledgeable about their environments. They knew which plants ripened first, which seeds were worth collecting, and which animals returned to the same places year after year. Domestication grew out of this knowledge. By repeatedly harvesting certain plants or protecting certain animals, humans unintentionally shaped their evolution. Over generations, plants became larger, less bitter, and more dependent on human care. What's especially striking is that this process happened independently in multiple regions. Farming did not begin in one place and spread everywhere. Instead, different human groups, facing similar challenges, arrived at similar solutions. In the Fertile Crescent, people began cultivating wheat and barley. In East Asia, rice and millet were domesticated. In the Americas, maize, beans, and squash followed their own pathways. Each center of domestication reflects local environments and cultural choices, not a single global blueprint. Think about what that tells us. Agriculture was not inevitable, but it was repeatable. When certain conditions came together, environmental stability, growing populations, and detailed ecological knowledge, humans repeatedly crossed the same threshold. This convergence is powerful evidence that domestication was a flexible process shaped by human decision-making. As we move forward, keep this idea in mind. The origins of agriculture show us that major evolutionary shifts do not require a single cause or a single moment. They emerge from the accumulation of small choices made under shared pressures. Understanding those choices helps us see agriculture not as destiny, but as one of many possible paths humans could and did take. Let's revisit what changed socially once humans began to farm. When people committed to agriculture, they also committed to place. Fields had to be planted, tended, and harvested, and stored food had to be protected. This meant people stayed put for longer periods, and over time, mobility gave way to permanent settlements. Think about how different life becomes when you no longer move with the seasons, but instead build your life around a single landscape. Let's look at what followed from this shift. Permanent settlements grew into villages, and villages slowly expanded into towns. Living together year-round changed how people related to one another. Daily interactions increased, cooperation became more structured, and social rules became more formal. You might wonder why this matters. The answer is that many features of modern society, rules, roles, and hierarchy, begin to take shape here. Agriculture made food surplus possible. For the first time, not everyone had to be directly involved in food production all the time. Some individuals could focus on other tasks, tool making, construction, ritual activities, or leadership roles. This specialization helped societies become more complex, but it also introduced inequality. Access to stored food could be controlled, and over time, differences in wealth and power began to emerge. Think about storage for a moment. Stored grain is not just food, it is security. It can be saved, traded, or withheld. In farming societies, those who controlled land or storage facilities often gained social influence. This is one reason agriculture is closely tied to the rise of social stratification. Status was no longer based only on skill or age, but increasingly on access to resources. Let's also consider how work changed. Foraging involved bursts of intense activity followed by periods of rest, and workloads were often shared flexibly. Farming, by contrast, demanded long hours of repetitive labor tied to planting and harvesting schedules. Daily life became more rigid, and responsibilities were often divided more sharply by age and sex. These patterns shaped family structures and expectations that persist in many societies today. Another major consequence was population growth. Sedentary life and reliable food supplies allowed birth rates to increase. Children could be weaned earlier with agricultural foods, shortening the time between births. More people meant larger communities, but it also meant greater pressure on land and resources. You can start to see how this becomes a feedback loop. More food supports more people, and more people require more food. Let's not forget conflict. As land became valuable, competition increased. Farming societies invested heavily in specific territories, making disputes over land more common. Archaeological evidence shows increases in fortifications and skeletal trauma in early agricultural communities. This suggests that agriculture did not just change how people ate, but also how they defended what they produced. So when we talk about the social consequences of agriculture, we're not just talking about farming techniques, we're talking about a complete reorganization of human life. Agriculture reshaped where people lived, how they worked, how power was distributed, and how societies were structured. These changes laid the foundations for cities, states, and complex social systems, but they also introduced new forms of inequality and stress. As we move on, keep this perspective in mind. Agriculture didn't simply feed more people. It transformed the social fabric of humanity, creating patterns of life that continue to shape the world we live in today. First, let's revisit what we've uncovered in this section. The shift from foraging to farming was not a single moment of invention, but a long process shaped by environment, population pressures, and everyday human choices. People did not abandon foraging because it failed. They adapted because circumstances slowly pushed them toward new ways of living. That distinction matters. Let's look again at the bigger picture. Agriculture anchored humans to place, tied daily life to the rhythms of planting and harvest, and reshaped relationships between people, food, and land. Think about how profound that is. For the first time, human survival depended not just on reading nature, but on managing it. Fields replaced migration routes, storage replaced mobility, and planning for the future became a daily necessity. Now, this part is important. Agriculture did not simply add food to human lives, it reorganized society itself. Surplus allowed communities to grow and specialize, but it also introduced inequality, new labor demands, and competition over resources. You might wonder why this matters for understanding human evolution. The answer is that these social changes fed directly into biological consequences that we can still see in skeletons, teeth, and health patterns thousands of years later. Think of agriculture as a hinge point. On one side is the long foraging past that shaped our basic biology. On the other is a new world of permanent settlements, growing populations, and increasingly complex societies. Once humans crossed that hinge, there was no easy return. As we move into the next section, we'll shift our focus from social organization to the body itself. We'll begin to ask a deeper question. What did this agricultural way of life do to human biology, health, and well-being, and what did it cost us biologically to feed the world we built? Thank you for joining this lecture. I'm Dr. Richard Jonathan O. Tadurin. I hope this session deepened your understanding of biological anthropology. Keep exploring what it means to be human. See you soon.